Hey there, everyone. Welcome to another video lecture for Psych 370. In my last video lecture, I focused on fixed ratio schedules and the patterns of behavior that we tend to see on fixed ratio schedules. So in this one, I'm going to do the same kind of thing with variable ratio schedules. Now, first of all, remember what a variable ratio schedule is. It's like a fixed ratio schedule in that it also involves getting each reinforcer after a certain number of responses have been made. But it's unlike a fixed ratio schedule because that number keeps changing. So it varies from one reinforcer to the next. So fixed ratio schedules always require the same number of responses for each reinforcer. Variable ratio schedules require a varying number of responses for each reinforcer. But on both kinds of ratio schedules, we tend to see high rates of responding. In fact, the response rate that you see on a VR schedule is pretty similar to the run rate that you'll see on an FR schedule. And guys, that brings up one general principle about schedule effects. It brings up one general principle about the effects that the different schedules of reinforcement tend to produce, which is that responding tends to be faster. The response rate tends to be higher on ratio schedules than it is on interval schedules. And as I mentioned in my last video lecture, it's pretty easy to understand why that would be the case. Because after all, on a ratio schedule, making more responses always means getting more reinforcers, right? It pays to respond at a high rate on a ratio schedule because on a ratio schedule, the more often you make the response, the more often you're going to obtain the reinforcer. There's a direct linear relationship between your response rate and your reinforcer rate on a ratio schedule. That's not true on an interval schedule. On an interval schedule, there's a maximum rate at which you can get reinforcers. So with them, there comes a point at which more work does not equal more pay. There comes a point on an interval schedule where responding faster doesn't get you reinforcers any faster. So for example, if you're on an interval schedule where the interval is 30 seconds long, then that means that at maximum, you can only get 2 reinforcers per minute, right? Because reinforcers are only becoming available twice a minute. They're only becoming available once every 30 seconds, either exactly or on average. So, because of how interval schedules work, they put a sort of ceiling on the rate at which you can get reinforcers. Again, there's a maximum reinforcer rate on interval schedules that does not exist on ratio schedules. On a ratio schedule, the only thing that limits how often you can get reinforcers is how often you make the response. That's true on fixed ratio schedules, and it's also true on variable ratio schedules. So that's why we tend to see high response rates on both of those ratio schedules. What makes variable ratio schedules different from fixed ratio schedules, again, is that on a variable ratio schedule, the reinforcer doesn't always occur after the same number of responses have been made. The number of required responses keeps changing, it keeps varying from one reinforcer to the next. It'll average out to something, though. So if you say that an animal is getting reinforced on a VR10 schedule, then that means that on average, it has to make the response 10 times for each reinforcer. But any given reinforcer might occur after only one response, it might occur after 12 responses, after 26 responses, or whatever. So, for example, if a telemarketer is getting reinforced for making phone calls on a VR10 schedule, then that would mean that on average, they have to make 10 phone calls before they make a sale. But sometimes they might make sales on back to back calls, and other times they might go 20 or 30 calls without a sale. So at the end of the day, they might wind up having made sales on 5 out of 50 calls or 20 out of 200 calls so that they're getting that reinforcer, they're making that sale on about 1 out of every 10 tries. And so, guys, what that means is that since the number of required responses keeps changing, reinforcers are highly unpredictable on a variable ratio schedule. By contrast, they're very predictable on fixed ratio schedules. On a fixed ratio schedule, you know that every fifth response or every 10th response should produce the reinforcer. But on a variable ratio schedule, you don't have that same kind of regularity. Again, when the reinforcer is going to occur is a much less predictable event on a VR schedule than it is on an FR schedule. And because of that, we don't see that stop and go pattern on VR schedules like we do on FR schedules. And that's another important general principle here as far as how schedules of reinforcement affect behavior. On variable schedules, the animal tends not to pause. It tends not to drop its response rate like that after it gets a reinforcer, because on a variable schedule of reinforcement, it's always possible that the very next response will get reinforced too. And so, because of that unpredictability of reinforcers on variable schedules, we tend to see much steadier responding on them than we do on fixed schedules. The response rate tends to remain much more consistent over time on variable schedules. It doesn't go up and down with pauses and bursts of responding like it does on fixed schedules. And guys, that unpredictability of reinforcers also contributes to one last difference that I want you to know about between fixed and variable schedules, which is that variable schedules tend to produce behaviors that are more persistent. They tend to result in behaviors that are more resistant to extinction than fixed schedules do. So, for example, let's say that I've got these two levers in front of me, a red one and a purple one. And let's say that pulling these levers is getting reinforced with candy bars. So I'm pulling levers for candy bars here. And let's say that I always get a candy bar after I pull the red lever 8 times. So pulling this red lever is getting reinforced on a fixed ratio schedule, right? An FR8 schedule. Every 8 pulls of the red lever gets me a candy bar. And we'll say that I get a candy bar about every 8 times that I pull the purple lever, but sometimes I only have to pull that purple lever once or twice, and other times I've got to pull it 20 or 30 times before I get the candy bar. So pulling the purple lever is on a variable ratio schedule, right? It's on a VR8 schedule. And now let's say that the candy runs out. So there are no more candy bars coming my way. None of my lever pulls are going to produce candy bars now. Well, think about it. Which lever do you think I'm probably going to give up on first? Which response is going to get extinguished first? Pulling the red lever, which was on a fixed ratio schedule, or pulling the purple lever, which was on a variable ratio schedule? Which lever am I going to quit pulling first when pulling these levers no longer results in candy bars? It's probably going to be the red lever, right? That's probably going to be the one that I quit pulling first because with it, I've learned to predict that every 8 times I pull that lever, I should get a candy bar. So when I pull it 8 times and I don't get the candy bar, I'll know something is up, right? I'll realize that something has changed about the contingency between making this response and getting this consequence. So I'll quit making that response fairly quickly. On the other hand, with the purple lever, I've learned that sometimes I've got to pull that lever a bunch of times. I've had experiences in the past where I had to pull that lever more than 8 times to get the candy bar, and I haven't learned to predict which pull of the purple lever is supposed to result in me getting a candy bar. So, because of the variable ratio schedule that pulling the purple lever had been on prior to this extinction phase that I'm in now, it'll take longer for me to realize that I'm in an extinction phase. There's no one surprising event with the purple lever where I would have pulled that expecting to get reinforced and then didn't. And so I won't give up on the purple lever as quickly as I will the red lever. So because pulling the purple lever had previously gotten reinforced on a variable ratio schedule rather than a fixed ratio schedule, that behavior will be more resistant to extinction than this other fixed ratio behavior will be. Okay? Well, I hope that makes sense. Please let me know if you have any questions about variable ratio schedules. But at this point, I can summarize a lot of what I've said so far about schedule effects by identifying 3 basic effects that schedules of reinforcement tend to have. First of all, ratio schedules tend to produce higher response rates than interval schedules do. We tend to see faster responding on ratio schedules than we do on interval schedules. Again, because on a ratio schedule, a higher rate of responding always translates to a higher rate of reinforcement, right? And that's not true on interval schedules. So we see higher response rates on ratio schedules than we do on interval schedules. Second, variable schedules produce steadier responding than fixed schedules do. So, like I said before, we tend not to see those pauses after reinforcers on variable schedules like we do on fixed schedules. So, the response rate remains much steadier. It's much more consistent over time on variable schedules than it is on fixed schedules. And finally, behaviors also tend to be more resistant to extinction when they're reinforced on variable schedules than they are when they're reinforced on fixed schedules. Because again, with a variable schedule, it's harder to predict when the reinforcer is supposed to occur. And so that unpredictable nature of reinforcers on a variable schedule makes it so that behaviors that get reinforced on variable schedules tend to be quite persistent. Those behaviors tend to persist for longer when they're not being reinforced anymore, compared to behaviors that previously got reinforced on fixed schedules. Okay, so guys, one way to remember how the four simple schedules of reinforcement affect behavior is just to keep those three basic effects that I just talked about in mind. We tend to see faster responding on ratio schedules than we do on interval schedules. We tend to see pauses after reinforcers on fixed schedules, but we tend not to see those pauses on variable schedules. And variable schedules also tend to produce more resistance to extinction than fixed schedules do. Anyway, again, if you have questions about any of this stuff, then please let me know. And I hope you have a great day. Take care.